Hello, welcome to episode 2 of 10 Texts on Painting with me, Matthew de Girardeau, and my colleague, collaborator, friend, Andrea Franchi. Today we're talking about Amy Sillman. Amy Sillman is an American painter. She's also an educator. I don't know where she teaches. She teaches somewhere, but famously, famously to people other than me until I started reading her, she also writes really well on painting. And so this is, maybe in the first episode, we're talking about how to get into writing about painting that really takes painting seriously as a kind of unique methodology. And this is that episode. Amy Sillman is really great on this. And we're both really blown away, as you'll hear in the episode. There's lots of things we talk about in this episode. First off, we talk about the 2 texts, which are her essay on colour, from Painting Beyond Itself, the Medium and the Post-Medium Condition, which was edited by Isabel Graw and was published in 2016. And then the other thing we read was Ab X and Disco Balls in Defense of Abstract Expressionism 2, which was in Artforum 2011. Volume 49, number 10, if you're interested. But I'll put the links up to those. We also talked about some other stuff. I might put some of these links up, but otherwise, Amy Sillman's website, amysillman.com, has almost all of her writing on there, which is pretty incredible, really, because lots of it should technically be, shouldn't be open access. But if you look on her website under the category writing, she's got writings by AS. The other stuff we talked about was the Amy Sillman episode of Dialogues on which is the David Zwerner podcast, hosted by Jarrett Ernest, which is a mini-series that he did on artists who are also writers. The other person we mentioned is Michael Lawton, who's a mutual friend, who's a painter and writer who lives in Spain. The other thing we talk about is basic design, which is like a fundamental kind of artist teaching method, kind of from Paul Klee. And I've put up a link to a little booklet edited by Elena Cripper and Beth Williamson. Elena Cripper wrote the excellent text that we read in the Sculpture podcast about pedagogy in crits and Anthony Caron sculpture. So that's probably worth a look if you're interested in history of British art education and what Andrea says about that. And then there's also an excellent Art 21 episode with Amy Sillman that I reference. And then finally, right at the end, we're talking about performance in painting, and I refer to an essay by Martha Rosler called The Private and the Public Feminist Art in California, which is from the September 1977 issue of Artforum and is available online. We talk about so much in this podcast, as you might imagine from all those references I've just given. But what I think we're really talking about overall is just how to write about painting from the inside, which of course can then be, it could be a model of a way to write about different kinds of practices from the inside. And Amy Sillman really has mastered that. And interestingly, I think that connects to the other thing we talk about, which is Amy Sillman's experience as an educator and the idea that all of her texts are excellent teaching texts because they don't assume that the reader knows anything about the subject matter. So there's an interesting contradiction there, or maybe there's a kind of dialectic there of how to write about something you know very well. Well, assume that no one else knows anything about it. Anyway, that's just a little extra aphorism for you there. It's a great episode. I will be back with you at the end of the podcast to say goodbye and to say thanks. Enjoy the podcast. Remember to go on your Apple Podcasts, your Spotify, your other podcast provider, and like and comment and leave us a little star rating or a little heart rating or any of those other things that you can do. The apps these days. All right, enjoy. I'll be back in a bit. So welcome to the Bad Vibes Club. I'm here with Andrea again.
Hi, this is when I say hi. Sorry, hi.
It doesn't matter. I'll edit that. And today we're just looking at Amy Sillman, really, aren't we? That's our subject today.
Yeah, I think she had so many different texts, and I don't know about you, but it took me quite a while to kind of like change my way of thinking, to kind of like really be able to understand what she was saying in a way. So I had to read a lot of Amy Sillman this week and listen to a lot of Amy Sillman and watch a lot of Amy Sillman. So that kind of like became the whole project.
So one of the texts I think was in another book, was in that Isabel Graw book, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the texts is Amy Sillman. It's called On Colour. And the other one is an article for, where is that? Is that Artforum or something? I can't work out from the font. I'm trying to like deduce. Artforum, yeah.
Artforum.
And it's called AbX and Disco Balls in Defense of Abstract Expressionism 2. I'll put the link up for the Art 21 video, because that Art 21 video is great because it's Amy Sillman talking about her own approach to painting. And there's definitely something from that video I'll mention when we're chatting about things. But yeah, I think that's super interesting that it did take me a while to get into her style of writing. And I think Amy Sillman is maybe you could say something about Amy Sillman because you kind of alerted me to her existence. Or maybe it was our mutual friend Mike, right?
Yeah, it was Mike. I think Mike is the first person who talked to me about Amy Sillman. And I've always found really hard to recommend text to painters, and painters have to write in our course. And it's always like a big of a problem of like, how do painters write? And then Mike, to me, is always a big reference because he has this kind of sideways practice of using fiction as a way to think about what he's doing in a very like indirect way. And then he recommended Sillman as someone that I should look at and recommend to students. But I never I read one text and then I recommend that to students, and I never really spent time on it. And then I think like 2 years ago, I was listening to this podcast, which you could put a link to as well. It's really good, from the David Zwirner podcast. It's an interview with her, and the person interviewing her is saying, your texts are like this kind of basis to all the painting courses in the US, like all the kind of like art pedagogy for painters in the US is based in reading this kind of text to learn how to think about painting. So I've always had it in the back of my mind, and this has been a great opportunity to just like really, really get into it. And I'm a massive fan now.
Yeah, me too. I think she's great. So these two pieces are interesting because, well, On Colour is interesting because it alludes to this very big idea as though she's going to propose a theory of colour, and then is almost the opposite of that. Or not the opposite, it's what we were maybe talking about a lot in the last series, which is, I would say, it's this kind of anecdotal, digressive, irreducible way of writing that artists do. When artists write well, they do it in this way, and it produces a very kind of weak theory of colour. You know, we were talking about weak and strong theories last series, about this idea that a strong theory is strong because it applies to everything ever, but in that way it kind of gets old quite quickly because it gets quite tiring to have something that applies to everything. But actually what's great about On Colour is that it's a painter talking about paint and talking about the relationship of paint colour to other kinds of colour as well, but it isn't really a theory of colour. I don't know, is that a good description?
I think the idea that this is weak theory to me is really interesting because it's coming from like it's writing that is coming from her specific experience of painting, which I think is what I got from I was thinking about last week's podcast, and I was very ill, and I just regret so many things that I said, and I was so grumpy. But I think the thing that I got is I think you were really good at like finding those sentences that were about the specific knowledge that you can get through practice. And I think this does what I wanted last week, which is like is someone who is a painter, has a very specific practice, and it's about this kind of knowledge that you only get through making, that you can just read about it in a sense, or you can't just again come with these generalizations, or that you're not escaping into language and thinking about what is the image that is represented, or doing like a political analysis of. It's just like it's really about the act of painting, and or like the knowledge that you have through the act of painting, and I think that's why it took me so long to get my head around it, and I had to like read it so many times because it's a sort of knowledge that I'm not used to encountering, in a sense.
She might hold in the podcast world a similar position to Felida Barlow held in the last series, because she is a teacher as well, right? Do you know where she teaches?
No.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to Google it, but she's a teacher as well, and she's a painter, and she writes about painting. And one other thing that's a little bit similar to Barlow is that some of her positions on painting are kind of not out of date or old school, but just kind of quite like there are some things she wants to defend about painting as a very specific practice. And Barlow had the same thing about sculpture in the round, or sculpture as something that has a relationship to the body or something like that, where, you know, she really, really wanted to defend the 3D-ness, the kind of physical nature of it. And Sillman does the same thing about a few aspects of painting. And it made me think a little bit about getting older, and like getting older as an artist and finding yourself maybe out of step with the dominant ways of thinking about art, and about how you phrase yourself when you're trying to say, oh yeah, you know, that stuff is interesting, but I'm still really concerned with X because that's a big part of my practice, without sounding like a grumpy old person.
That is so funny, because to me, that is such a, I'm sorry, but that is such a, like a, it's not about being old. I think it's like a gender relation to teaching. So they're not like Frida and Amy Sillman. They're not the sort of teachers that will go and tell you things. They wouldn't go and be like, plinths are stupid, or this and that, or like, and come up with this, you know what I mean? They're not like the Anthony Caro style of teachers. They're teachers that are like really about kind of going through the most basic level and nurturing that from below, so that there's space for people to take that in lots of different ways. So to me, it's not about age. It's like a really pedagogical choice. It's almost like the career back theory of pedagogy. It's like a pedagogy that is now constructed through like a heroic and authoritarian and power position, but it's a pedagogy that is constructed in a way that is very embodied and caring. And in the David Zwimmer podcast, there's this really incredible moment when he tells that her texts are interesting because they're always teaching text, which I think Barlow's texts are also always teaching text. And what made them teaching text is that they always assume that the reader doesn't know anything. And she kind of has to kind of construct the basics from the very basic. And she has this amazing anecdote when she says, well, don't you remember that? Like, don't you remember going to art school and looking at a painting and being like, oh my God, what are all these people looking at?
Oh,
like,
yeah.
You know, all these people are like looking at this thing, and then they drop a few names and like a few theory names, and you're like, oh my God, who are these people? I've never heard of these people before. Why am I expected to know all of this? And she's saying, like, you know, when I teach and when I write, I do it for that person who's finding themselves in that position when they don't have absolutely any tool to relate to this thing. And you have to remember that you were that person, instead of being a snob and being like, oh, I can't believe you don't. To me, that's like feminist teaching at its best.
I don't know. I mean, I definitely, I think that is a very well-made point. I just think that I don't know what their teaching styles are like. I haven't heard from their students, but I can imagine them snorting and saying, well, that's what painting is about, or that's what sculpture is about. The thing from that Art 21 video that Amy Sillman was in, she says, you know, Frida Barlow had that question she would always ask her students, which was, have you taken it outside? Have you tried putting it outside? Amy Sillman's one is, what's your unit? What's your unit of painting? And she means, is it a brushstroke? Is it a certain amount of time? Is it, you know, she gets all these interesting answers. And then she can't answer it herself. I think the interviewer says, oh, what's your unit for painting? She says, like, oh, I don't know.
Because there is no right answer. That's the whole point of the pedagogy, is that there's no... It's just a question. But
I wonder whether Barlow's question, have you taken outside, does point to something that she thinks is fundamental about, so that there is a right answer, which is take it outside. And that for painting, I don't know. I mean, obviously Sillman didn't say this in the video, but I just wonder if she does think that there are certain things that the painting does have this idea of a fundamental unit or something. Anyway, let's go into the text, because otherwise we're going to do this the general chat, and I think it is definitely more interesting when we get into it. I mean, it seems obvious that we're going to start with the first paragraph of On Colour.
Yeah.
Recently, an art historian and I surprised each other. I told him that even if I were blindfolded, I would know whether I was holding a tube of cadmium red or a tube of cobalt violet because of their difference in weight. He didn't know this. He had never held pigment in his hands, and he didn't know that cadmium red is heavy and cobalt violet is light. This surprised me because the weights of these pigments are fundamental to a painter, and not knowing their differences seemed absurd to me, like not knowing the difference between a coat and a t-shirt. But my job and that of the art historian are different. Mine is to hold colour, and his to behold it. And this split is as old as the hills.
Yeah, I mean, I love this. I also I had a teacher who was not a painter. She did a screen painting, but she used screen painting as painting. So she constructed like unique images. So it's not about reproducing the image, but she used it as a technique to put like paint in the screen, in the canvas. And she was always talking about, because her best friend was an art historian, about all these discussions they would have when they would go to galleries and they would look at something and she would be like, well, this was clearly, I don't know, made from a picture. This was done like this or by that. And their historian would be like, how do you know? And then he'll go and do all this research and be like, you're right. Did you know this artist? And she's like, no, I just looked at it. And she always talked about that. And I always felt kind of envious because I don't think I ever, I never got to understand painting at that level. So I think this was one of the things that I really love about this. And the other thing was, and I read this like 20 years ago, so I might be completely wrong, but just thinking about art school pedagogy, I've always been interested in the history of art school and the history in art school in different countries. And there was this essay that I read that said that art schools in Europe, including the UK, come from the art academy. So they come from this kind of like understanding of making or position of the artist in society. But the art schools in universities in the US come from art history. So like art history was in the university. And then art historians, there was like a side of art historians that decided that actually you can't theorize about art if you don't know how to make it. So the art schools came from this kind of like early department exercises to try to think about making in a epistemological way, that there was something that you could understand through learning how to do things that was really important to the theorization and the historization of that thing. And that creates a very different relationship to like between like making and knowledge and academia and what is valued and things like that. And yeah, just being in that sort of spaces, right? Like, which is very different. I think where I teach, for example, at Chelsea, where like, it's all about artists in a way. But where I went to my BA, we did have an art history department and we did have an art department, and you were always having, and you also have a philosophy department. So you're always having these discussions that are complete. It's very present, the way different knowledges are produced and valued and kind of authority, and that you can have a conversation across, which I really miss here. I really miss being part of a university where those discussions are occurring, I guess.
That is interesting because obviously Chelsea and Camberwell, where I work as well, they are art schools. There is no art history department even. There are like, the contextual studies people or whatever. But there's definitely not a philosophy department. Whereas at Kingston, I mean, currently the enlightened management of Kingston are just about to get rid of the Centre for Modern European Research. What is it? Centre for Research into Modern European Philosophy. CREMEP. What a brilliant acronym. But yeah, they're present, and I've been to their seminars, and people can get co-supervision across on PhDs and things like that. So yeah, it's like, because it's part of a bigger university, there is a wider discourse around art that's happening there. But yeah, that's funny actually. I hadn't really thought of that. That's like my one of my supervisors actually, Volker, was telling me in Germany they have the two different words for the different kinds of knowledge, right? They're like basically the university knowledge and then the technical knowledge. And you can get to all the different levels. You could be a doctor of technical knowledge, but they have this kind of hard split. And what's interesting in the UK, right, is you have this previous old school hierarchy of technical colleges and art schools which weren't part of the university system. And then what happened was those were just absorbed into the university system and everything became degreeable or MA, well, I suppose they aren't all MAs, but you know what I mean, master's level-able. But you don't have an incorporation of the understanding of the different kinds of knowledges. You just have this kind of, how do we turn this into a degree or whatever? And yeah, it produces the kind of weird mishmash of the British art school system now. What I thought was interesting about this was that it did a really painty thing, but then it kind of surprised me. So she says, it's absurd that he didn't know this. Where is it? Oh yeah, not knowing their differences seemed absurd to me, like not knowing the difference between a coat and a t-shirt. Like that is a diss. But then she says a really interesting thing. Their jobs are different. Hers is to hold colour and his is to behold it. So she gets to do that painterly thing of like dismissing the idiot who doesn't paint and therefore doesn't know what it is to be a painter. But then she actually makes a point out of it. And I think it's that second part that makes her a good writer, right? There's a lot of painters who who would write the first part, but there's not so many who would write the second part. And then she talks about colour theory. And this was interesting to me. You must have done colour theory, right?
Yeah, I did. I did all the Albert stuff, all the Johannes Itten stuff. I thought it was really lovely because sometimes I get like students that buy those little books about color and stuff. And so I kind of like totally missed this. I forgot this kind of the exercise of having to like make all your color swatches and make all these different types of gray and paint them. And it's just this.
Can I read the quote and then you describe it? Because
Yeah.
I never did it because I didn't do painting, therefore I didn't do this stuff. But to learn colours from Joseph Albers, to do his exercise, you first have to gather colour swatches like ingredients, splice and dice them, layer them and shift them around to test them out on your eyeballs. So is that literally you mix all the paints to make the swatches and then you literally move them around? Oh.
Yeah, and just like putting, you're making squares inside of squares and putting like grades next to different colors and you're actually seeing. And it feels really, I don't know, when I did it, I have to say, I thought it was really, I'm saying like it was amazing. I don't think I'd really realized how amazing it was. I thought it was really boring. I was like my first year BA and I have one class that was just that, it was like a whole term. It was called plastics and it was all these Bauhaus exercises. And it was like, I don't know, like it was a month of doing these things and bringing them in and painting all these different grades and stuff and being like, oh my God, what is this? But now I look at it and I'm like, oh, there's like a nostalgia being like forced to engage with the material of paint and pigment. And I think it's something that is going to come in her writing, but I think it's going to come through the whole series, which is, you can like, you realize, oh my God, this kind of like, and I don't remember the qualities of each pigment, but this like blue pigment is transparent and this pigment is opaque. And it's just like they make for very different color qualities because the white of the paper comes through in a certain way or something, that you kind of like come to these like insights that in a way you can only come through encountering paint.
Yeah, I never did it. So it's just, to me, it just seems like all I think about when I think about colour theory is like Kandinsky and it just being some mad spiritual thing. But yeah, I like this idea that it's, there was a series of kind of practical experiments and laboratory nature of it, I think.
And I think was interesting when we were looking at pedagogy last year for the sculpture thing is that there is this moment for like 15 years, 20 years when the UK art schools use the Bauhaus system. I forgot the name. It's called, I think it's basic something. There's like this moment before the change that kind of like makes it quite heavily conceptual and based on sculpture. So there is like it would be interesting, and I hadn't had time to look around it, but I was thinking, what is this generation of artists that had, that went to art school in those 15 years, where?
Well, I mean, I don't know if this is so true, but the foundation in art and design, which was a mainstay of most British art school students, the thing they did before they went to art school, was based on the Bauhaus system. But it's mainly about the bit of going between the workshops and doing like a few weeks in each workshop, or however long in each workshop. I don't know about the colour theory stuff.
I think so is the change. So there's this there's this kind of curriculum called I think it's basic design, and that is before the Cold Stream report. So when the Cold Stream reports, it kind of cleans the Bauhaus influence away of the British art school. So they take it away, but I don't. I find that super interesting because I have massive problems with the Cold Stream.
Oh yeah, basic design.
I have massive problems with everything.
Nice. All right, there's a little booklet we can put edited by Eleanor Cripper, a little tape booklet.
Yeah, exactly. We read it for the sculpture pedagogy thing. Or I read it for the sculpture pedagogy thing.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. All right, so have you got another? Where do you want to go next with this?
There's this sequence that is all about the materiality of paint. So she's talking about how you kind of like learn to understand the different like I was saying, what color is transparent or what isn't.
That's
so
great.
Each hue adds an early anthropomorphic character to the operations in a painting. A painter will know that Naples yellow will make things turgid. Chromium oxide green is overbearing. Flake white has a dry indifference. Tallow blue seems filmy but always end up domineering. King's blue appears classy at first, but is really kind of vulgar. I love that. Also, she's so cranky in the loveliest way. Really.
Yeah.
I want to get my crankiness to be lovely like that.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was trying to get at before, I think. I like the bit after that where she's talking about, which is part of that same sequence. Who can resist the mythic narratives of the origin of pigments? The colour called carmine is made from acids extracted from the body and eggs of female cochineal insects that live on prickly pears. Tyrian purple, a state similar in ancient Rome, was a dye made from the secretions drained from the glands of predatory sea snails, and so on. And I thought that was really interesting kind of switch. And she does this a little bit later, actually, as well, where there's another kind of contradiction. Because she says, she's basically talking about the materiality of paint, but then she essentially talks about this idea of those narratives, which are presumably true histories, but maybe not totally true in the contemporary way that paint is made. Calls them mythic narratives. And I like this idea that underneath all of the materiality of paint, there's something really poetic and something really mythic, which is still kind of romantic and or romanticizable by painters. And it's this kind of knowing nod to
because painting is romantic, isn't it?
Of course it is. No, you're right. Yeah. She's talking about buying paint. She says, I need this equipment and I'm seduced by the ritual of purchasing it. That little ode to going into an art store, which is really nice, that she writes about. Which I used to feel going into Wilkinson's and buying loads and loads of gaffer tape, but they closed. So
yeah, I also feel like, I don't know, I haven't been in maybe I've been just going to the wrong art shops here, but I think like in Brazil, and then when I've been to New York, I've been to these amazing shops where I do encounter all these people that have all this amazing knowledge of materials. And here I've been going, I don't know, I think because I used to do printmakers, so I used to be really into like pigments and mediums and all that stuff. While here I just go to, I don't know, normal shops where you just get stuff on the shelf, and it made me miss that kind of like very different relationship to materials and stuff that I think I've lost since I moved here, because my practice have changed. So universe is like lost to me somehow.
I really enjoyed it when I was making these collages for the last show, and I got to go and speak to technicians and the art store people about different kinds of adhesives and the best, just like different decisions you can make around what adheres to what and what look are you going for with the glue that you're using to stick the thing down, and why Linda collages look like they do and stuff like that. It was really fun. It didn't, I ended up buying something pretty straightforward, but it was nice just to have that chat and like be invested in those conversations. Because and so much of the sculptural material I use is chosen precisely because it's not the sort of thing you buy in an art store. So I don't really go into those places very much, and I don't really have a question for those people. And it's so nice to have a question for, someone who has lots and lots of technical knowledge.
And then money. Yeah. I love the bit about money. Like, I never think about money.
Really?
I think about money all the time, but I don't think about money in relation to painting. I don't know, like this kind of like, I don't know, like I haven't looked at the price of painting for a long, long time. And it was really nice. You had this list. Can I read the three?
Yeah, definitely.
I really love it. 1 ounce of cadmium red light costs the same as an ounce of the best caviar. The same red costs as much as an ounce of cold-packed human red blood cells. A small tube of cobalt violet costs the same as a bottle of Dom Perignon. A large bag of the same pigment will cost you as much as a very large bag of cocaine. A 1/4 ounce of cadmium red will cover a meter of canvas, but if Barnett Newman painted it red, it will cost the same as a bar of gold.
I thought that was my favourite. That line's great. I do like that. I do. So this is where it got a bit like, ugh, for me, when she did the stupid diagram on the next page. It's a very I just wrote incredibly silly. Like, because then she does this thing where she's like, but if you, basically she says that in pleasure hours, it's, an ounce of cadmium red is worth $100 million, and just because it lasts for a long time and stuff. And I just thought, like, I think that's fine, but I don't need a whole diagram to tell me that you like painting. And also, it also kind of swerves the question, right? Which to be honest, she does address lots elsewhere, but like, well, really, that's about the kind of about value and questions of value in painting, which is obviously not totally divorced from questions of value in the materials you use to make an artwork, obviously. So like this notion that, you know, if Barnett Newman painted it red, it would cost the same as a bar of gold. And it's like, well, if Barnett Newman painted it red, it would cost about as much as a Barnett Newman costs. Do you know what I mean?
Oh no, it's because of the thickness of the paint.
No, I know. No, I know. But this is where she's kind of like, it's fine because it's the point of it is to talk about color, but there's a kind of obvious discussion there around value and why painting is deemed valuable is because it uses expensive paint, right?
Oh, it's funny, like I didn't think about it in that term, in those terms, like at all, because I think, I don't know, there's so much stuff that is like, you know, super valuable and use like crappy acrylic paint that costs nothing. I don't think like
that's true, yeah.
I was thinking more in terms of like the economy of a practice is like, you know, how much, when I think about my students and how I would like them to have this different relationship with painting and pigments, it's like there's a cost to that relationship. That there's a reason why people paint with crappy acrylics. It's because and it's the reason why you can't be a student at Chelsea that use red like Barnett uses red, because that's like a lot of money to spend in reds. So I was thinking about it more in like that side of the economy of like who has the access to use materials, and it goes back, you know, there's a point when she's talking about this economy is a lot larger as well, right? It's about like the cost of extracting this paint, the cost on the environment, the cost on your health. I don't know. I used to like open like, you know, lead-based white painting with my teeth when I was in art school and stuff like that. Or like there's no ventilation and things like this. And this is still, so there's a cost to painting. For someone who chooses to be a painter, there's a cost to that practice that is very, again, it's like there's a material dimension to it, like who can do that and who can do that in that way, and who can prepare canvas, you know, who can make their own canvas and prepare them, and then who, you know, just paints in cardboard with like cheap paint, because that's.
When I used to work in Colchester at this art school that had a very kind of diverse set of students, was realising all these students were making paintings on little tiny canvas panels that they're buying from the art store, from Amazon or wherever. I was like, oh, we should, you know, why don't you try a bigger painting and see what happens there? And slowly realising, oh right, it costs loads of money if you buy all these like horrible pre-prepared canvases. So then just like sending them downstairs and getting them to start stretching their own, making their own stretchers and stretching their own canvases and stuff. And that totally changed. Also, we had a load of canvas that they could use, but that totally changed their practices, because suddenly they could make things not just bigger, but just also just like whatever size and shape they wanted. So people started making interesting shaped canvases, or making like long, thin pieces, you know, kind of non-standard shapes and sizes. And that was like, yeah, again, obviously not being a painter, not really immediately having that understanding. It was a bit of a revelation when I realized that was the reason, that it just costs loads of money. And every time you want to make a painting, you have to like think about the cost of that painting.
Yeah, or like think about different structures. I'm a very big fan of Elizabeth Peyton, which I think is a very non-trendy position to have. But she was very massive when I was doing my BA, and I still really love her. And I was listening to an interview with her the other day, and, you know, she makes these really small paintings in these really weird pieces of paper or card. And she was saying like, well, I was living in New York and I was just like, you know, I didn't have a proper place and I was sleeping in people's sofas. So I needed to have a painting practice that I can just put in one suitcase. And that was my suitcase that I would take, you know, to stay at different places with my friends, or like, you know, to go to college and back. Or to me, that's the more exciting thing, is like, because that's the sort of art that I'm interested, is the art that kind of like is really embracing the kind of like material parameters, or like the, you know, the conditions that are set up. You're never waiting to have a gallery that then is going to give you the money so that you can get the right materials to do the work. But it's like, what is the work that is created under the conditions of living? And I love her paintings. I think they're extraordinary. And I think they're extraordinary because, you know, it's because of that tension. So I went to this show yesterday that is at the South London Gallery, which I need to check what the name of the artist is. Right. Christina Chimesi, and I was texting you. It was really amazing to go to a show after reading all the Amy Sillman, and I recommend everywhere to do that, just to go and look at painting after reading this. And there were so many things that I noticed that I don't think I wouldn't notice in any other way. But I was looking at, she's using this kind of very sophisticated supports that are covered with velour, and she has these oil sticks, and the pigments are so strong. There's like, now I'm like, oh my god, there's so much pigment here, but you can see the work before the work that is here. And I was texting you because I was thinking like, oh, the work has changed so much, and I think it has become more complex, and the way she uses color again is a color that stops being reproducible and things like that. But like, just thinking about this discussion now, it's also like, the work she did before having a gallery and the work she did in a sense after having a gallery. Like, what is the work? How does that kind of like sudden funding affects where the work can go and things like that, in a way that I hadn't thought about it before.
And for you, was that a clearly positive effect on the paintings?
Well, I've just been saying that, no, I mean, I don't know, because I was just been saying with Elizabeth Peyton that no, that shouldn't be a thing. But I find, the more recent painters, the more recent paintings of her are a lot more accomplished than the earlier work. So I don't know.
Well, that is the
it's
maybe
complicated.
Then it's a question of like what happens to certain practices when they change because of whatever gallery representation or some kind of upsurge in their ability to get money for their work. And for some practices that means they kind of necessarily get better because the best version of them costs more. And for some practices it means they change for the worse, and maybe for Peyton it just meant that she had to work really hard to not change her practice or something like that. I guess for different artists
she didn't have to sleep on friend sofas anymore.
Exactly. But the point being that she didn't suddenly then decide to do like big paintings or something, right? Like, she carries on making these small paintings that she's really known for. Maybe we should move on soon, but there were a few moments for me, because I'm always interested in like, these kind of theories of art that pop out of artists' writing. And I think she says at one point, I'll just do two quotes, and then early on she says, colour is just the tool that a painter wields in making a painting. And I thought that's interesting. And then she says, in terms of her painting, colour is a primary tool for negation in my work. Colours that block each other out or contradict each other and are mixed in I don't understand this, but an archaeological dialect of continual destruction and reconstruction. I really like that. So just to, she has this general idea of like color is some kind of fundamental tool in painting, and that in her, it's what she uses it for is to negate. So because she talks about this in the Art 21 interview, right? She puts paint on without a brush, often just kind of puts it on, and then her job is to scrape it off, and she's kind of constantly getting herself into situations and then has to get herself out of those situations. And it sounds like she's doing that with colour as well. She puts on a colour only then to try and negate it with another one, to kind of block each other out or contradict it. And then that kind of sets up the momentum in her work to carry on with the painting and to, like, I guess, know when a painting is finished or know where it's going or to let it guide you or something like that. And I think those moments are really important in artist writing because they tell us about the things that can't be described in an artist's practice. They kind of are ways of describing how you get to the point of being able to work intuitively. And I think that's really key because often the designation of the split between practice and theory is that effectively, there are bits of art that can't be written about. But for me, it's about like what great artist writing does is gesture towards the bits that can't be actually directly described. And I think those bits are great in Sillman, where she kind of gets this dialectic going of like, oh yeah, so what you need is you need these two things to happen and then suddenly you're off. And I really like that idea.
I have another one, which I think it's less poetic than yours, but I think it's also like a really interesting summation of her practice in a sentence, which is: color now expresses a combination of the art supply store, the vicissitudes of reproduction, and an understandable modern impatience with the slow experience of determining paint and color in a lonely art studio. Yeah,
I had an underline under that. She's talking about, this is the end of a section on what colour theory is now in art school pedagogy and also in contemporary painting more generally, which she mentions about, work that is mostly seen through reproduction on a screen and so on. It's a great quote. Oh yeah, she has a good bit about her own palette. Oh yeah, that she finishes with. Maybe my way of mixing colour courts wrong feelings such as gaudiness, irritation, queasiness, bitchiness, like the off-kilter feeling of an ugly acrid yellow-green shine I always liked, which could simply not be represented in photography. And I think that's really nice. Again, just getting to this kind of point of being able to identify affective or emotional things in the way that she mixes colour. It's like such a nice combination of this material and, what would she call it, mythic stuff that painting does. Oh, I guess it's romantic stuff that painting does.
And I think this, to me, I've been thinking about this a lot. She talks about it in other ways as well, in other sections, like this idea, of like color and, when you're going and you're not making your own paint, but you're like just buying these colors that are like, defined by trends or like different like companies, and kind of digital standardization of colors. So you have like RGB and you have CMYK.
Well, she talks about the introduction of hue, this like 3-dimensional color axis, doesn't she? Hue and saturation or whatever.
And there's something about, I think it goes back to that point when we were like talking last week about what are the things that I'm interested to read around painting. And it is about, in a way, one of the reasons we always go back to like the image and the meaning of the image and image making. It's because we access a lot of those works through the digital or the printed. So the image is the only thing that we have access to. And we don't really kind of like confront the materiality of the work. So I think we're living at a moment where, to me, it's really interesting. There's this tension, right? Because there's like all these artists that are doing work for the digital and galleries that are doing work for the digital. And then you have all these students that just access work through the digital, through like Pinterest and Instagram. And then you have this other universe. And I don't know which one of them is going to win, or if there's a winner. But they definitely exist in tension, which is these people that are making work that cannot be reproduced digital, that, just, again, like, thinking about the show at the South London Gallery yesterday, but also Rosa Tehorst, who's the creator of Gasper. She does these amazing works that are so not Instagrammable. They're so bad for Instagram. And I really love it. And I think there's something quite active about like making work that will always look bad and it doesn't like conform to those expectations of being transformed into an image, that are fighting for like art is more than just image making in a sense.
I've spoken before about how I always make things by mistake that I then realise I can't take good photos of. But what's interesting, we haven't obviously spoken much about Amy Sillman's painting, which I think is really great. But I'm hesitant to speak about it because I've only seen it in reproduction. But it does work quite well, I think, her work in reproduction. But I would like to see it in person, because obviously the stuff she's talking about the kind of essentially material nature of painting, it would be a bit silly for us to then have a whole chat about her work. Have you seen it in person or only on
No,
screen?
Only online.
Hey, should we just do like 10 minutes on the Abstract Expressionist article?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So this article is called In Defense of Abstract Expressionism 2 because TJ Clark did a text about 15 years. I think this is about 2010 or something. I can't actually remember. Do you know?
2011.
2011. So TJ Clark did a text called In Defense of Abstract Expressionism in 1994, and she's kind of, I guess, responding to a different whatever and defending it in different ways. Have you got a quote you wanted to pull out of this?
Not a quote, but she, on one of the podcasts, I think the David Zoomer podcast as well, she talks about how the history of why she wrote this text, and it's because there was this big exhibition of abstract expressionism, I think at MoMA, and then there was this person that was talking about, abstract expressionism is all about these men, it's all this kind of like men painting, and then she was like, but most of the paintings were by women. It's like, why? And I listened to this podcast that she has with Ellen Molesworth talking about Lee Krasner's work and things like that. So she was like, and I love it because this is how I write as well. She was talking about, how her writing has become a lot more about like just someone annoys her so much. And then she has to like engage with that annoyance at some level. So these texts come from this annoyance of like someone saying like abstract expressionism is just this thing that, that these dudes did, and it's all about masculinity, and it's all about all these things, and what that sort of erasure of all these women like Joan Mitchell and Lee Krasner I don't know. I find it, I really like it because there's a history of these things happening, right? It happens with tech. It happens with like when, in an attempt to like do a critique of gender or race, you actually raise the people that were part of that, and you sort of like make you worse. In a sense, you kind of like create an exclusion instead of actually understanding the tensions of the dynamics of the time and what that thing actually did. So to me, that's more interesting in a way than her response to T.J. Clark. I tried to read it. I know you like T.J. Clark. I couldn't. I read like half the text and I couldn't.
I mean, I don't know his writing really before this specific book, The Sight of Death, and it's that stuff I'm interested in. Apparently his new book is particularly bad. It's just full of like anti-woke weird essays about how identity politics has ruined everything or whatever. But so I don't know their text either. But I think what's nice about the first page of this, I write that she kind of gently splits apart the art and the artists, and through kind of complexifying that gendered relationship, or the machismo or whatever of abstract expressionism, and kind of through gentle irony as well. So she's doing all this stuff of, opposing the two critiques of abstract expressionism. So she says about, there's one version of it that's like nothing but bad politics still welded around a chassis of machismo, that the paint stroke, the very use of the arm, is equivalent to a phallic spurt, which is, of course, a reversal of Clement Greenberg's earlier but no less testosterone-driven notion of abstract expressionism as a pure and transcendent optical experience. So she kind of, gently complexifies it just through the, almost like reductionist versions of what abstract expressionism is. And then she says something funny after kind of doing this work of saying like, look, it's still worth talking about for these reasons. She then says, maybe it's possible for me to look at AbX through rose-coloured glasses because I came along too late to actually have to date any of those artists. and I didn't have to sit on their laps at the Cedar Tavern, which is the famous bar.
I think it's lovely in terms of writing because I feel like she does like 2 paragraphs of paranoid reading. She's like, yes, this is the cliche. We all agree on this. This is where you're like, oh, this was like a CIA thing. And then you talk about like liberal politics. And yes, we all know this. Like every time you say this, and I've been in so many situations people say these things, you're not saying this something new. You're not doing this massive political statement. It's like, we all know it. Let's move on and actually look at the thing. So I think it's actually an amazing example of like paranoid and reparative reading.
Yeah, true. Really good.
In action, in terms of methodology.
Yeah, you can't just go straight in with like a good faith defense of the worst excesses of mid-century American art in general, to be honest, can you? But she does a really nice job of making it fun to like both understand the context and then kind of take that apart a bit. What I really like, there's a moment where she's talking about everyone trying to get away from abstract expressionism as fast as possible once it's under glass, once it's kind of institutionalized. So it's on the second page of writing, and she's talking about different artists either fouling the high of AbX by courting the low, or screwing up the ab part by embedding it with pictures, or just moving away from New York. And I thought that was really interesting, this idea of like, actually what happens with abstract expressionism is that a lot of people are kind of getting out of it in interesting ways. Because she writes another piece about Philip Guston elsewhere, about why he was so kind of well loved. And I guess it's because of how he got out of abstract expressionism, like how he kind of made his escape from what could have been an end point. What else do you want to talk about in here?
I love this bit when so it's like the kind of the paragraph before the last on the second page, and she goes, I wouldn't call this negative way of working de-skilling, though. It was more like an active embrace of the aesthetics of awkwardness, struggle, nonsense, contingency. And then a little bit later, abstract expressionism was simply one technique of the body for those dedicated to the handmade, a way to throw shit down, mess shit up, and perform aggressive erasures and dialectical interrogations. If you want to make something with your hands, if you want the body to lead the mind and not the other way around, you might likely end up in the aisle of the cultural supermarket that includes painterly materials and abstract expressionist delivery systems. Canvas, oil, sticks, fat paint brushes, rags, trowels, scrapers, mops, sponges, buckets, and drop clothes. First of all, I feel like all of these things feel so, and I think she talks about it earlier, but they're so feminized, right? They're like modes of practice that have been traditionally that I think we talk about this a lot, that when women do them, they're considered traditionally feminized modes of practice. And when men do it, they consider like heroic, kind of authorial subject expressing themselves modes. And I think there's something about the way in which those practices can be associated and not to abstract expressionism. So one of the things she talks, not in this text, but I don't think in this text, but in some of the other writing, is she talks about the kind of the joy or the discovery of all these kind of like young artists or students of her that kind of embrace things that people from the outside, their first reaction would be like, oh, this looks like abstract expressionism. You should look at Yves Klein. You should look at Pollock. And she's like, no, they're arriving at this from this other place because this is just like a body impulse in the way that you relate to painting. And this is just like and there's something quite interesting about this kind of, as well, like this kind of pedagogical recognition that not everything needs to immediately, it's like again, it's like an art school, I would say like maybe it is a British art school thing, I don't know, but this kind of idea that you immediately have to like categorize something and be like, wow, you should look at this person because it comes from this. But this is kind of framing it in the other ways, like abstract expressionism use these things that have always already been there and that have always already been this way to relate to painting that is a very embodied, material, gestural, handcrafty way to relate to painting that goes beyond that.
Well, I mean, we kind of missed out the central thesis, which for her, she says that abstract expressionism has a close relationship with Susan Sontag's description of the camp, right? Which is at the time it's almost meant to, like in the reductionist reading of abstract expressionism as gendered machismo, it's meant to be the opposite of the camp. But actually what she's saying is that for the students that came after that, it was necessarily camp because it was outdated and stuff in that way of being kind of like slightly out of fashion. But essentially when you get back into it, it's like you say, it's kind of essentially leaning on these things. She says, let me read it. Sontag's famous list of qualities for camp, the exaggerated, the fantastic, the passionate and the naive, were the ones we studio students leaned on, and we were alive to the slightly outmoded feeling of ab-ex. Yeah, without having to lean on it as a historical moment, you could just kind of reuse all of those ways of painting because they say they're the kinds of painting that young painters really want to engage with or something. But I like this idea that it's kind of always already camp because of its exaggeratedness, because of these things that are kind of essential to its relationship with the canvas and with paint and stuff.
I think there's something about this relationship with like bad art, right? And she's talking about its very sentimentality and ridiculousness propose a rich archive for future conceptual painting that use the bad taste and bad values of the art world as springboards rather than as endpoints. And I think there's something, it's like kind of like the cross between like, again, like when I studied in art school, like abstract expressionism was the end of modernism in a sense, right? This moment when like, and then postmodernism comes. So until that point, these things are so serious and people are trying to make paintings that are like good serious paintings that are doing things. And after that, everything can be fun and funny and bad on purpose. And kind of all these kind of like negative connotations have a very different way to circulating. And I kind of, how can I say this? I think there's something kind of joyful about how the gestural, in a sense, can't be that serious again, or that the gestural then becomes queer, then become this other thing, which I think I think maybe that's the point. In a way, you can't separate them anymore. Once that gesture is queered, it becomes kind of ridiculous to try to make it serious again.
Yeah, and I think later she's talking. I'll read the quote. I don't find it odd that ab-ex practices have now been vitally reinvigorated by a queered connection of the vulgar and the camp. Many artists, not least of them women and queers, are currently recomplicating the terrain of gestural, messy, physical, chromatic, embodied, handmade practices. And as she said, as she says here, which this is the point I wanted to make, I would argue that this is because ab-ex already had something to do with the politics of the body. And that it was all the more tempting once it seemed to have been shut down by its own rhetoric, rendered mythically straight and male in quotation marks. So it's like, this kind of queering of abstract expressionism by, the generation that she's talking about, this video artist, Lady Churchman, who makes these kind of action painting videos, for example, which she sent me the video of, and I didn't manage to look at, but look kind of like, they kind of look like 60s performance art. I think they must be shot in a certain way. Anyway, the point being that it's like already in abstract expressionism. It's not just about like subverting or undermining all of these macho posturing of abstract expressionism, but rather once it's been subverted and undermined and left a bit camp, it could just be reused in a joyous or more celebratory way. It doesn't have to always be a critique of the past or something like that.
But I also think it's sometimes it goes beyond that. It's not that it doesn't have to be a critique of the past, but sometimes it just doesn't have to engage with the past at all, in a sense.
Okay.
That those practices exist, but they don't necessarily refer to it or like inheriting them in any way. It's just something that is available as part of the vocabulary of what painting can be.
Yeah, and again, she does a nice thing later where she kind of reads other things that would never have been thought of as abstract expressionism. She's talking about Carolee Schneemann's 70s performance up to and including her limits. She talks about Paul Thek's paintings, Yayoi Kusama's dot paintings, Helio Ortisika's street actions and stuff. All people who wouldn't have ever been thought of as related to abstract expressionism. But if you read it in this way rather than this kind of heroic maleness or whatever, this, exaggerated, joyful, gestural way of making, they kind of connect to those ways of doing things as well.
See, but I think that's a very funny list because, how can you look at Carolee Schneemann up and including her limits and don't think about abstract expressionism? That's like a direct reference. That's all I thought the first time I saw that video.
Yeah, but that is
that
interesting.
She's making fun of the videos that were made of those dudes painting. Well, I think Helio Ortisika Porangolese, I'm like, what is it? It's just an artist that uses their body in a completely different context. So I have massive issues with that, with putting all those things together.
I can't speak to Ortisika's practice, but to Schneemann, I think what is interesting about her is that I would see it as I would have read it as a joke about action painting, but I would have also read it as a joke by a performance artist about painting. Whereas now I know a bit more about Schneemann and know that she comes from a painting background and has made slightly iffy statements later about all her work having some relationship to painting, then there is much more of a direct relationship. And then I just read something recently about Paul McCarthy that kind of, is that the Jenny Klein piece? I can't remember if it's that or another one that I read. Basically where the writer places Paul McCarthy in this line where he's taking a lot from those videos of Jackson Pollock painting and other ways of action painting in the early work that he makes with paint, where he's like, he like opens a can of paint and then drags himself along the floor behind it and so on. And again, it is interesting to really think about what certain kinds of performances are doing in relationship to previous art. Because often, for me at least, performance, because it gets historicised in a certain relationship to Dada and avant-garde work, it just is almost like it has nothing to do with all of these other art forms. But actually, really, late 20th century performance often comes out of sculpture departments or painting departments and so on. And so I do see that. I see how generative it is to suddenly think about those artists in a new way. Because to me that happened to me when I started thinking about, what about painter? What's the difference between performance artists who started in painting and performance artists who started in sculpture, for example.
Oh, it has the best paragraph. I love the ending paragraph. Can I read the ending paragraph of the text?
Yeah, do it.
It was so funny for me to realize that the people who loved my formalist rap the most were the guys who had gone the furthest in their own personal lives to make specific change to their own forms. So she's talking about 2 or 3 trans male students that came to talk to her after a talk. We were both committed to an idea of the inseparability of form and content, and were working with their interactions, their malleability. If you could change one side, you could change the other. This made for a funny alliance, funny haha and funny peculiar. And I think we're going to read at some point like this kind of like new tensions in paintings that come from black and brown paintings that are like using painting traditions, or like using painting discourse in a different way, and you kind of have to like rethink the whole thing. And there's something really interesting about this kind of like queerness and transness in relation to abstraction and what it could do, that I thought was really exciting. This kind of like revision of formalism and what the form does, and things that in a sense feel like, at least in my part of the art world, are very untrendy in a certain way, and being like completely taken over. I just really loved it.
No, I really agree. The whole paragraph starts, she says, "It reminds me of an occasion about a decade ago when I went to give a talk somewhere in America at a university department that was populated by self-described content-driven students and faculty. Content-driven was how you said it back then, meaning we work with politics and abhor the supposed emptiness of formalism." And this is Sillman being cranky, right? "So I naturally insisted extra hard on the form in my work, taking a certain perverse pleasure in describing myself as a kind of formalist." And I think that's what she's cranky about, is this like the assumptions about formalism being necessarily kind of whatever, conservative in nature or something. And so what she's interested in is the assumptions about certain ways of making things, which is what the whole essay is about, right? This like assumption that if you like abstract expressionism, you're some kind of like, I mean, she does do a good description of like the defenders of abstract expressionism being clammy armed, flag waving Americans or whatever. But the point being that she doesn't have to be a clammy armed, flag waving American, as you know, as long as you kind of engage with it on these more complexified way or whatever. But yeah, it's a nice idea. This idea of like formalism as actually being something that can happen in identity or something. And yeah, like I think you said, I don't know if you want to talk about this, but in that SLG show, there was maybe some writing or a video that kind of really focused on the content of the work. And you really noted that it made no mention of the formal qualities of the work or something. And I guess that's what she's, not interested in. It's something that just tries to make a painting into a picture or a story or something like that.
But I think what's interesting to me, and then maybe this is a good like way to close up, is like we have also done the same thing in this podcast, because that's the way our brain works. We immediately go into the art historical discussion or the pedagogy discussion, because it's so hard to kind of like talk about painting in itself. And I think this is why, I mean, I've read this text so many times, and I read a lot of her other essays and listened to the podcast and stuff. And I would really recommend people to do it, because I think she's really good at expressing it. She also has the same anecdote. So she's kind of telling the same thing over and over again in a bit of a different way. So you can sort of like get it. And even though I can't reproduce it because I don't have that material knowledge in a sense, so it's really hard for me to kind of talk about it, I did feel that when I went to see the paintings, this is something that has completely changed the way I look at painting and think about it. And in a way, that's the whole point, isn't it? So I would like, I feel like we have completely failed in transmitting that in a sense, because it's just, it's like you sort of, the only way to do it would almost just like read a bunch of like sections from the text where she's kind of like directly passing that knowledge in this really practical and specific way. But I think everybody should read and or listen to the podcast or watch the video or do all of those things, because there's something. It is like really good theory that kind of like it's transformative and it changes your brain and you can't go back.
Yeah.
So it does that. It took me a while to get there, but once has done that, it has completely like enriched my experience of looking at painting again.
But I think, to go back to what I said earlier, I think it's fine that we spend our time talking about art history and pedagogy and whatever stuff that isn't insights into the haptic knowledge you gain through being a painter, because I think that's what you can talk about. And what's funny is that sometimes through chance or luck or through certain phrasing or tone or something, you gesture towards that knowledge. And I think what's nice about Sillman is that she is focused on getting towards those moments and does the work. She does that art historical work of like setting it all up so that when she gets to the insight, you're ready to receive it. And I think it's, that's the mark of a good writer, is that she knows the bit that she wants to pass over is quite hard, but she does a lot of work in making the journey to getting there like really fun. And also, we have to fill the hour. If we just read out like 3 quotes from an essay, we definitely wouldn't be achieving the minimum you need to be a podcast, like a 35-second podcast or something. Maybe that's better. Maybe that would be much better.
No, but I hope that, I don't know, by the 10th episode, we have developed, I have faith that we can develop the skills and the language and the kind of like the way to just incorporate this different way of like, because we're not going to become painters, but I'm hoping we're going to become better at looking at thinking at painting. And then we're going to become better at expressing that. And then we'll be able to talk about it, because we can't talk about it because we don't know it yet. We're just like starting to get, we're like in the beginning of understanding how this thing can work. It's such a different, again, it's part of the way that our practice develop, right? Like I've never had like I had like 2 weeks to just like read about painting, not get it, and then read it again and be like, no, this is like, I have to make this happen. So to force myself through it. So I'm hoping that, as we go on, we will slowly be able to not always fall into the historical or the kind of like the image or the narrative in the image or things like that, but kind of like become more aware or develop a sense of attention that would like be more tuned to these other ways of thinking.
Welcome back. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, as always, to Andrea Franchi. Thank you to Amy Sillman for painting and the writing. And thank you to you. You are the listener. You are technically the reason that we record this podcast, and we'll be getting so much nice feedback about the painting series so far. So do get in touch if you've been enjoying it and give us, as we know, Andrea doesn't care about your recommendations, but I do. I'm interested in knowing what you think is good writing on painting. Already had loads of great recommendations. And yeah, just remember to comment and like and star and heart our podcast on whatever app you use to listen to it. And we will be back with you soon with an episode on Philip Guston. Yes. All right. Love ya. Bye.